All right, I think we're recording now. Yeah, okay. So I apologized for that. I don't know why it was not doing what it should be doing, but hopefully you can all see this. And let's go ahead and get the show on the road. All right. No more technical difficulties. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about ferns in the southern garden. And I don't have a whole lot of stuff here to talk about. It's mostly going to focus on the different types of ferns that we could have here in Georgia in zone 7B and 8A. Ferns are like one of my most favorite things ever because my land is mostly shady. So of most of the types of ferns that you will see in this presentation, I probably have most of them. And I do want to give credit where credit is due. My lovely mom, Shirley Bohm, helped me with this particular presentation. So I do want to give a shout out to her. All right, so how ferns differ from other plants. So they don't really have flowers or seeds per se. They reproduce through spores, which, they share some of those things in common with fungal organisms with the spores there. But ferns reproduce sexually by spores and sometimes vegetatively with rhizomes. So there are other things that use rhizomes. You can see that in grass. Like zoysia or Bermuda and other types of flowers. Most ferns are going to reproduce by alternating generations between their asexual and their sexual forms. So they're pretty cool. I mean, they're really neat. And so I kind of feel special when I see little ferns pop up around maybe my downspouts or something like that, because it took a lot more than just, a good old seed popping off a plant for that little fern to form. Epiphyte ferns or air plants will grow on another plant, but they're not actually parasitic. So I actually have, I don't know if you can see it. I have a window behind me. There it is. So I have a little air plant there. You can kind of see it. I've referenced
still see your screen.
What's that?
I still see your screen.
You still see my screen. Oh,
yeah.
You didn't see my little air plant?
I want to see your little air plant.
Let me see if I can. Remind me at the end, and I will take the filter off because I think here I have to unshare. It gets complicated trying to unshare, but I will show my air plants behind me when I'm done. So just remind me if I can, or if you can, Perfect. If you don't mind that.
Perfect.
So air plants are not parasitic. So just a quick run through. Parasitic plants are going to be those that are going to feed off the host. Mistletoe is one of those. It actually will put roots down into the plant that it is on. Air plants are not parasitic. They just kind of hang out. They utilize the canopy of the tree to get up closer to clouds or where the humidity is. Typically you're going to find those in more tropical regions, but again, they're just up there. They're using that tree as a structure to get closer to what they need to survive. Spleenworts are a family of ferns with very dark, shiny stems. And the name is kind of based on a old-timey or historic thought that those plants had medicinal value to the spleen. We could probably do a whole nother talk on common names of plants and where those common names come from. A lot of them do come from folklore and kind of what they were thought to have as a medicinal value from way back when. Horsetail ferns have very, very small and very specialized leaves. And whisk ferns don't have any leaves at all. So there's all sorts of different kind of structures, plant structures that fit into the fern family. So the parts of a fern. So, just a little bit of botany here. So you have your frond. Almost everybody is probably going to know that. I don't have to tell you that they have fronds. The pinna, or is the further division of the frond, and you can see here in this little diagram that that's going to be the like leaflet structure that you would kind of think of in a tree or off a branch or something like that. The rachis, this is going to be the main stem of the frond. The pinule, the branching stems of off of that frond. The stipe or the petiole, that's the portion of the rachis without the pinnae. And fiddlehead, that's going to be your very tightly coiled new growth frond before unfurling. And just a bit of trivia. So if you ever watch the TV shows Alone or Naked and Afraid or anything like that, fiddleheads are highly prized as a food item and there are still people that will go out and collect them, but those are considered edible, if you were curious. Continuing on with the parts of the fern, the sporangium, those are going to be the specialized structures on the underside of those leaves of the fronds. So some ferns are sterile. They're not going to produce any spores. And the fertile fronds, those are the ones that produce the spores, are going to have the sporangia, and they're on all ferns or all fronds. Sorry, still dealing with a little bit of dry mouth from the cold that I have. If you were on my last talk, I'm surprised I actually made it through that one. Sorry about that. Okay, spores. So again, just very simplified. These are the reproductive structures of the fern. So, sorry, admitting some people here. So they don't actually have gametes, but this is how they actually reproduce. The sori, when they develop in the circular patterns or the rows on the entire leaf there, sporophyte, that's the adult fern stage, where they're going to either reproduce sexually or asexually. And the gametophyte, which as those spores mature, they're going to germinate into those structures. And those tiny little forms, they're going to have male and female sex organs, and they're going to join to form sporophytes. I know that's probably way more than you ever wanted to know about how a fern reproduces. So general care and maintenance of ferns, most of us are probably already going to be pretty knowledgeable about this. If you've ever had the Boston fern in your house, sometime in the winter time when it's nice and dry in your house because the heat's on, they start losing their leaves and they get really unhappy. And that's because humidity is too low. Now they do prefer indirect sunlight. So while they can handle, pretty shady conditions outside, and this goes for both indoor and outdoor ferns, they do like dappled sunlight. They can tolerate morning sun. They don't particularly care for afternoon sun. That's pretty hot. Sun's more intense at that point. But they are known as a very shady, shade-loving plant. Most ferns are going to have a temperature preference of between 60 to 75 degrees. So that's not exactly what we have here in Georgia. We can get pretty steamy here. But there are quite a few varieties of ferns that do really well here. I have, at least, like I mentioned, probably 3/4 of the different varieties that I'll talk about here at my house. And they're all, pretty happy. But if you've ever been up north to maybe say Wisconsin or Minnesota or up in Maine, maybe on the Pacific Northwest, you will note those ferns there are considerably larger. They're very huge, and even up into the mountains here. And that is a function of lower temperatures, more moisture, more humidity, that kind of thing. They do prefer slightly acidic to a more neutral pH. So most plants, garden plants, or trees, shrubs, that kind of thing, are going to have a preferential pH. So pH being, a scale from, 1 to 14 with 7 in the middle being neutral. Most plants are going to prefer somewhere about a 6.2 to 6.5 or 6, 7 being neutral. And ferns are no different. They're going to be kind of right at about that sweet spot that most other plants prefer. They like very moist soil with high humidity. Again, most folks are probably going to know that. So you're going to want to make sure you mulch when you have them in your landscape. Here it says wet moss, but you can use pretty much any kind of mulch in the landscape. Even leaves, they're perfectly happy with that to try to keep their roots nice and moist. And in a house, you want to keep some kind of peat moss or something else over their roots, and they do prefer misting. I mentioned the old Boston fern losing its leaves in the middle of the winter time because of the heat kicking on in the house, and so you can kind of counteract that by misting that fern to increase the humidity level. They are really easy keepers. They're not heavy feeders, so you don't really have to fertilize them. You just have to kind of give them a little bit of generalized care, so cutting back leaves, and removing dead fronds, getting, just kind of cleaning them up. So make sure you're spritzing them pretty regularly, especially in the wintertime if they're inside. Outside here, we don't have to worry about the humidity level. We've got plenty of that. But you do need to make sure that they do have something covering their feet, keeping their roots nice and moist. All right, landscaping with ferns. So if you have a shady house and a shady yard, you probably already know all about ferns because that's one of the few things that does really well down here. And you can get them in all sorts of different sizes and heights and shapes and leaf colors. And, there's all sorts of different interesting ways that you can use them. They do prefer moist soil, but there are some ferns that will do perfectly well in drier upland soils as well. But you can use them in rock gardens. So if you are lucky and you have some granite outcroppings on your land, or maybe you've brought in some rocks that you've decided to make part of your landscape, these will do very well around that in a shady area. They go good around water features, or if you have a stream on your land, or maybe a little pond or something like that, or a low area, maybe a rain garden. You can put these in here. They do wonderfully. They don't mind wet feet. They go really well in woodland gardens. So if you have a native woodland garden, and maybe you have some paths that are kind of meandering through that, having lots of ferns to look at. Like I said, there's different heights of ferns and colors, and mixing them in. I'll give you some other plants that do well. That looks really pretty, very lush and green, and a great place to hang out if you put some hardscape in there. They're also good for erosion control and ground cover. So if you are in a super shady location, there are options, and ferns are a good one of those. So a lot of times when folks have erosion issues, they'll call us up and they'll ask, what can we put on the hillside to try to keep the soil there? If it's a sunny area, obviously not. We have other options for that. But in a wooded area, maybe where they're dealing with some erosion issues, this would be a really good option. They're also great for low spots and drainage areas, places that are kind of collecting water, maybe. And sometimes, it's not worth it to fight with nature. And so if you do have a low spot, turn it into a rain garden. Just kind of work with it. It'll look really pretty, and you probably won't regret it. So plants that thrive with ferns. So there are lots of low light plants that will do really well in Georgia, and they go really nicely with ferns. So you can do astilbes. I have some of those. They do prefer more water, so keep those in mind for a less upland area and more of a low-lying area. Toad lilies, I have some of these. I had a bunch in a pot. They got killed from the freeze that we had this last winter, but the ones in the ground did okay. Ajuga, that's another good one. Bleeding hearts. Bleeding hearts are kind of, they do okay, but they are probably more of a temperate plant. It gets a little hot here, and they're not really happy with that. Hosta, there are so many hostas out there, so many different varieties, so many colors. Um, Hostas and ferns are probably my most favorite plants, and I have them all over the place. They do very well together. They're very pretty, and lots of different shades of green. Lungwort, yellow cordalis, epimedium, hellebores, of course. I have tons of hellebores. They do really well with the ferns. They're very hardy. Wild ginger is another good one, and coral bells. I have several of those. They prefer a moister area. So again, those do really well with ferns. So propagating ferns. A lot of times people would like more free ferns. I mean, really, who doesn't want more plants? Most of us are always looking for some free plants someplace. And generally, if you go to any nursery and you want any kind of a fern, they're not the cheapest ones there. They're usually pretty expensive. So if you can propagate them, then that's a good way to save money and gift your friends some of these free ferns. So there are different methods that you can do. I mean, just go online, you can find YouTube videos, and there's all sorts of fun things that you can do. But probably the easiest is you're just going to collect the spores when they're really dark. So if you notice, maybe you got some Christmas ferns or something like that, you notice that the spores on the back of the leaves are really dark and they start to fall off, you're going to actually snip that frond and put it in a paper bag. And then you're just going to shake it up and you're going to knock those spores off so that they're falling into the bottom of the bag. And then you're going to get a sterile moistened potting mix. So just go buy yourself a fresh bag of potting mix for ferns. And here it looks like we've got some plastic tubs of some sort. I don't know. It could be like a 5-gallon, not a 5-gallon, like a 1-gallon milk jug, like half of it or something like that. Or you could just go buy a tub, at Walmart. They sell a 10-pack of, shoebox tubs for like $6. So those are perfect. You can order those online, or sometimes they have them in the store. And you just put the potting mix in the bottom of those, and then you're just going to kind of keep it nice and moist. Then you're going to put those spores directly onto that potting mix and just kind of tamp them down very gently, and then just mist. So super simple. And then cover that pot with plastic and put it in a tray with a little bit of water. You don't want to put that in the sunlight because you'll cook them, but put it kind of in a shady, indirect sunlight area, and that will help keep that nice and humid. And that plastic, that's going to make it a little greenhouse effect where you'll have a nice humid environment in there, perfect for germination. So you're just going to keep adding water to the tray until the tiny shoots, and you can see here on the far left, it just kind of looks like algae starting to grow over the soil, but that's what it looks like, starts to grow. And then when the fronds start appearing, you can see here in the middle, you can start transplanting them into individual pots for further growth. And this can take a while. I mean, it's a very slow process. Ferns are not fast growing plants. So choosing your fern. So there are different types. There's clumping ferns and there's spreading ferns. And I did mention there are some that prefer much moister soil and some that'll tolerate very dry conditions. Some require completely full shade. They are not going to be happy with even dappled sunlight, and some are perfectly fine in part shade. And then you also want to kind of consider the color of the leaves and the stem and the fiddleheads. So, I mean, you see here a Japanese painted fern. Those are really pretty. They have purples and kind of whites and light greens, and some are a very, very deep green, and some are very light green. So, all sorts of different shades. And then, of course, you want to look at the size of the adult fern. And then, consider whether they're native or not. If that is something that is very dear to your heart, you want to make sure that whatever fern you're choosing definitely goes in your garden style. All right, so Southern shield fern, we're going to start running through some different types here. So I have some of these, and these can get very tall. So here it says 2 feet tall, but I've actually seen them taller than that. So if you have them in an upland area where it's a little drier, they will be about 2 foot tall. But honestly, if you put them in a moisture area, I've seen them 4 feet tall. No, not a lie. So if you give them quite a bit of moisture, they're pretty happy, and they'll grow and show. So these are natives, and they're kind of a lime to a medium green, and they love the South. They love the heat and the humidity. They thrive in that. So these do really well in a situation. And the more moisture they have, the more prone to spreading they are. They do spread by rhizomes. They prefer the shade in the moist soil, well-drained soil, and they're pretty deer resistant. I can vouch for that. Anybody's heard me complain about my garden and how the deer keep getting in there, they actually leave these alone. I have these in several locations around my yard. They don't particularly care for them. So yay! And they make a good ground cover. They'll fill in an area relatively well, and they are very lush and pretty looking. Christmas fern. I have these also. These will grow wild around here. They're natives, and if you know where to look, you can find them. I know I'll call out my mom. She goes up to her place in Sky Valley and has dug quite a few of these for the Master Gardener plant sales. But these are very pretty ferns, very easy keepers. They will live in a fairly dry environment. I've had them, living. I got some at an old abandoned home site in Tallahassee County, and I have had them planted here for years, and nothing kills them. It's a very dry area. So these guys will be about 2 to 3 feet tall, evergreen all year round, very pretty. They can tolerate, dappled to full shade. These don't get any indirect sun. They're perfectly happy. These will form clumps. They don't grow by rhizomes. They're very non-aggressive. They will get very lush looking, but they don't overcrowd, in other words. So you can put them in a slightly wetter area and they will get bigger and fuller, lusher. But again, that's not necessary. They'll tolerate dry, and you can cut them back and they'll come back with new, fresh green growth, new fronds. And these are fairly deer, rabbit, and drought resistant. Again, the deer don't seem to bother these, and I have some of these back by my garden. And they were named because of the fact that they're still green around Christmas time. Cinnamon ferns. So these are also native, and they can get to be about 2 to 3 feet tall. I have seen them much larger than that. I purchased some from a gentleman up in Cleveland, Georgia, up in the mountains, and we drove up there to pick these up and some other plants that I'd gotten. And he had several that I swear were as tall as my child was when she was 6 years old, which was, I don't know, well, maybe she was older than that. I swear they were like 4 feet tall. They were huge. They were very large, very wide, big, very healthy. And they will take some sun. I don't personally I have a few. They aren't in full sun, but they're, supposedly they can grow in full sun to full shade. They do spread by rhizomes if they're happy, and they'll form colonies. They're great around creeks and in swamps and wetlands. I've seen some of these, you know, in a swampy kind of area, and they're quite happy. They're very beautiful, and much like a lot of things, if you try to dig them up and bring them back to your garden, they're never quite as happy as they were where their original site was, but they're pretty flexible. They will form two types of fronds. They have the fertile fronds that are kind of that silvery fiddlehead that turns into that cinnamony colored frond that you see there. And then the larger green sterile ones that surround the center. So that cinnamon name comes from the fact that it looks like a cinnamon stick. Particularly, this one is rabbit resistant. So if you have issues with rabbits, this might be a good choice for you. And they do, the fronds do turn a pretty kind of yellowy, orangey color in the fall. So lady ferns, these are kind of innocuous. You'll see them in, you know, the understory. These are natives, 2 to 5 feet tall. I've never seen them get up to that 5 feet. Most are about 2. The new fronds and stems are going to be kind of a reddish color. And these are deciduous, so they'll die back in the winter. You won't see them. And they tolerate partial to full shade. It grows very slowly. So I think I have a few of these out there and they're in full shade. They are in a drier area, so they're not very fast growing. These haven't really done much. I probably should move them because they aren't a fan of upland areas. But anyway, these are also a nice addition to the woodland garden. So the southern wood fern, again, native, 3 to 4 feet tall. These are deciduous, meaning they die back in the wintertime, and they're going to have that kind of a pretty golden green color. They have these really kind of backward arching fronds that taper around the tip, and they will tolerate kind of the dappled sun to full shade. So they don't do well in like the cinnamon fern in any sunlight. They do very well in very heavy clay soil, wet soil, and high temperatures and humidity, which is perfect for Georgia. So look into these maybe if you're looking to do a woodland garden. The northern maidenhair fern. So these are kind of interesting and different looking. I have had one pop up as a volunteer around my HVAC unit of all places. It was very happy to do that where the drain was. So obviously in a very wet area, it's kind of shady back there. But yeah, I had one pop up as a volunteer, and I don't have a clue where it came from because I don't have any in my yard. And I don't know of any of the neighbors that have any. So just this one lone fern. And it will spread very slowly. It has rhizomes, finely textured fronds that kind of spread like from the top. Fiddleheads are kind of a reddish color. And they're not usually very big. They can be really tiny. Mine's only about yay big, but they can get bigger like you see in the top left picture. So they're kind of pretty. They're a little bit different as they have a kind of a dark veining with a contrast against the lighter green leaves. Southern maidenhair fern, so 6 to 20 inches tall. These are kind of small, and I think personally would be great if you had a water feature with some rocks that you were looking to kind of incorporate a different looking type of fern. I think we've all seen these. Sometimes they're in fairy gardens. You might have some in, you know, in and around a water feature that you have, or a terrarium. They're kind of a good choice for that. They prefer full to part shade and will grow in crevices if, you know, along a water feature or where water is available. So if you ever go up in the mountains hiking, you might see some growing in and along some of the trails up there along the water. It will go dormant if it doesn't get enough water, and it's also deer resistant. Hay scented fern. I like the name of this one. So 18 to 30 inches tall, so it's a fairly tall one. And it does prefer up to full shade. So I don't know who went around sniffing this fern to come up with this name, but supposedly it smells like freshly mown hay if you bruise that. So I don't know, maybe people were sleeping on it. But in the fall, it'll turn, the fronds will turn this really pretty golden yellow. And it can be really good ground cover around creek edges and drainage ditches, that kind of thing. Uh, so apparently it can be invasive, but I guess that would have to be under perfect or ideal conditions. I've never seen it get invasive, but it's great for naturalizing if you have a low-lying area around a stream or something like that. It grows in all types of soil, so it's not real picky about where it grows, which is great. If you have really heavy clay soil, you don't need to worry about the really nice loamy soil. And it will even do well if the ground dries out, after. So if it's not in a low-lying area, in a slightly upland area, it'll still do quite well. Ostrich ferns, obviously named because as the fronds are unveiling, the fiddleheads are unveiling, they look like, an ostrich feather, right? So 3 to 6 feet tall. These can get very tall, obviously 6 feet tall, native and deciduous. So they will die back every year. And they also are part to full shade. They are clump forming, but also will spread by rhizomes. So if they're quite happy where they are, they will creep along and fill in an area. They can be pretty vigorous. I haven't seen these become invasive in and around here. I did put some in a few years ago, and they must not like where they are because they're about the same size and they haven't spread at all. So I think they have to be very happy where they are to spread. They're good for erosion control because of the rhizomes. So if you have a lower lying area and you're having some issues with erosion, consider these. And the fiddleheads are edible. So I mentioned the old Naked and Afraid or Alone episodes, and you can actually harvest the fiddleheads and eat those. They do prefer a fairly neutral pH. So around here, where it tends to be more acidic, that might be an issue. But yeah, no, they'll do okay, and they're deer resistant, which is always a bonus. So royal ferns, again, another native, and these will have kind of a bright green frond. They look a little bit with the spore forming, the fertile frond, a little bit like a cinnamon fern. But they're not. The main part of the frond or the non-fertile frond does not look like that at all. So we sold some of these a couple of years ago at our plant sale that we got from a local distributor, and I think some of you guys bought them. I wasn't really happy with their quality. And truth be told, I don't even know if they survived, and I planted them in a good location. So, which is probably why they're not our supplier anymore. Supposedly, they can grow in full sun if you give them a lot of water, and they can tolerate in wet feet standing in shallow water. So, you can always try that. Maybe I would think if you have a morning sun area where maybe it loses its sun at about 2 o'clock or so, and you've got maybe standing water or an area where your water catches, and it kind of, you could put some of these there. I'm always looking for a good plant to recommend to folks if they have landscape issues, and I would just have to find a different supplier because you don't see these very often around here. And they're pretty resistant to rabbits and deer, and they prefer slightly acidic soils, more organic. So if you're going to plant them, make sure you probably are going to have to amend the soil a bit. Sensitive fern. So 3 to 4 feet tall, deciduous. So again, they're going to lose their leaves in the wintertime, and native. They will tolerate full sun, but you've got to keep them really wet. So if you're going to do that around a water feature or something like that, make sure that there's always
Hello?
water. Um, they're going to prefer, let's see, they're going to have fern-like leaves, but they don't quite look, they look almost more like a staghorn fern, kind of unusual looking fronds. They're named sensitive fern because it tends to be pretty sensitive to moisture. So again, have to keep it very wet if you're going to keep it near the sun or keep it in the sun. And if it is in an ideal environment, it could get invasive. So just something to kind of keep in the back of your head. But to me, I think that would be, it'd have to be pretty wet. So, I don't know if I worry about that too much. So again, good place for drainage ditches or wet spots in your yard. And then just kind of keep an eye on how it grows and if it's kind of getting away from you. Netted chain fern. I have some of these and they get about 18 to 24 inches tall. I have some on the side of my house where it gets, it's fairly wet, pretty shady, and they're just now, after 3 or 4 years, getting to be about 18 inches tall. So it takes them a while to get established and be happy before they're ready to grow. They will grow in wet, acidic, organic swamps, bogs, pretty much any place that has a lot of moisture. So if you got to have a downspout or something like that, planting some of these guys there, they probably would be pretty happy. Again, part to full shade, and they have creeping rhizomes, so they can colonize into rather large areas if you're not careful. But again, very slow, very slow. Like I said, it's taken, and these guys are by a downspout, so it's taken them at least 3 years to even act like they were going to survive, let alone thrive. And they're similar to the sensitive fern, which is a little bit larger, and leaflets on sterile fronds. So they also look kind of similar. Resurrection ferns. So very tiny, 4 to 8 inches long, and they'll live all sorts of different places. So it's an epiphyte, and it will grow on other plants and dead wood. But again, it's not parasitic. Epiphyte, that's not a parasitic plant. Again, mistletoe is a parasitic plant. This guy is just like your air plant. And I'm sure Cindy will remind me to show the window. But it's just an epiphyte. It's not going to hurt anything. It uses its roots to anchor to wherever it wants to be. And it spreads by rhizomes. So sometimes you can see, I'm trying to think if there's any place up in the mountains where you can see, of course, it's got to be pretty damp. And I think up in Raven County, I've seen some of these. They can shrivel up and lose about 97% of their structure. And when it's drought, when there's just not a lot of water around, but they will pop back to life when you get water to them, hence the name resurrection. And I guess the little tidbit down here at the bottom is that they can accumulate the sugars in the cells to protect them and stabilize the membranes so that they don't dehydrate and die, which is kind of interesting. Japanese painted fern. So there's a lot of folks that have these in their garden. 10 to 15 inches tall. They're very hardy and will keep their leaves all winter long. They're very showy in the shade because they're kind of a silvery green with purple. And they're, just like this says, have lots of different cultivars. And so you can get lots of different colors, different within that purple, silver, and green shade. And some of them are very, very showy. So would look really pretty next to some hostas or some other types of plants to kind of show off. They do prefer moister soils, not completely wet, but you know, they do prefer moisture. I've had some in more upland areas and they've not been that happy. When I've had them in areas where it's been a little moister, they've been happy. So just, it does say here fairly drought tolerant, but, you know, that's debatable. Don't over fertilize. They don't most of these plants, they're all, you know, pretty native. This is, again, is not, but compost is just sufficient. They'll get the organic matter that they need from doing that. And they are decently deer resistant, but rabbits do like them. Again, I never had problems with rabbits, and we have those here too. Lots of those. But you know, you've got to have the right spot for them. Japanese tassel fern. We've sold these at the plant sale the last so many years, and I have some of them, and I've actually put them in pots and had them on my front porch, and they do really well there because, you know, everybody loves the look of the Boston fern, but of course they're not hardy, so you have to either bring them in or some people just let them die. So I had put these into pots and had them on my front porch, and they've done quite well. They're pretty happy. So 24 to 36 inches, and they're pretty fairly kind of a semi evergreen, but mine stayed green throughout the winter. They prefer the part to full shade, but they'll tolerate the drier conditions. You know, it was kind of dry last summer, and you know, they'll wilt like anything else. But I was pretty happy with how well they looked, even though they, you know, weren't getting watered regularly. They're clumping, but not overly aggressive, so they're a good choice for an area if you have a small area and you don't want them to spread into the woodland or anything like that. They are a very shiny green color. They're very pretty. And I guess that gets its names from the kind of the goldy coppery colored hairs underneath the leaflets, which are kind of weird looking for a fern, but interesting. And this one is deer and rabbit resistant. Remember, resistant just means that if they have eaten everything else, they're going to come for it anyway. But if there's other stuff there, they'll go to that first. That's all resistant means. An autumn fern. So there is some contention here. Some will say that it is invasive. It tends to be what I would consider a category 4, which means it's got to be perfect conditions for it to take off and become what would be classified as invasive. So these can be 24 to 36 inches. They are native, but they prefer full shade. And again, slightly moist, acidic soils, high in organic matter, which is going to be mostly what these ferns are going to need. I have a bed on the side of my house that have had autumn ferns in it for, golly, 10 or 15 years. And they haven't really spread. They're in front of my house too. They haven't spread at all. They're perfectly happy. It's nice and shady, and they get downspout water. And, you know, again, I haven't had any problems. I do know around streams that, you know, if you have a very shady area, you have a high water, moisture, organic matter content, you may get some spreading. But I have not personally seen that. But just, you know, keep that in the back of your head in where you're going to put them, and make sure that if you're going to use them, that you're not putting them in a location where they could get out of control. They are resistant to deer and rabbits, and they're pretty cold resistant. They made it through just fine with the cold snap that we had this last winter. And so, you know, I'm happy with them in my landscape. Holly fern, we've sold these 2 to 3 feet tall, evergreen. You can cut back winter damage. You know, they do prefer full shade. I have some of these also. They're very pretty and do, you know, pretty well. They handled the cold snap really well. They're pretty non-invasive and clumping, do well in containers. So, excuse me, you can use them in a pot, if you will. I tend to do that. I have a lot of trees, and sometimes trying to fight the tree roots can be a problem. So putting them in pots, you can skip that. Tolerant of drought, salt air, and salty waters in coastal areas. Personally, I haven't really seen them used much in a landscape in coastal areas, but if you have a beach house, consider it. And they are somewhat deer resistant because of their leaves. Male fern, and we're wrapping it up. I know Cindy's probably sweating it. She's like, "Oh, Lisa's talking a lot," but I'm wrapping it up. I'm getting there. So these are 36 to 60 inches tall, so that's really tall, and they're native and evergreen except in very cold weather. So they need to be in part to full shade. So again, like most of them, and have a constant moisture source to stay fairly happy. So these guys are clumping. They look a little bit like the southern shield fern, and they will do well in clay soil like what we have here. Neutral, alkaline, acidic soils, they can tolerate it. We have that in abundance around here. So if they're in a situation like that, I think, they'd be great. They'd be fine. They're just not going to thrive and spread. They're rabbit resistant, but here it says poisonous if swallowed, although they do have medicinal qualities. I'm just going to tell you, don't eat it unless you're an expert, right? Just like mushrooms, you can always eat a mushroom once, at least once. Just don't try it. Don't say you saw it here. Ebony spleenwort. So this is a native, growing 20 inches tall, part shade, full sun with enough moisture. So maybe in a rocky outcropping where you have a lot of moisture, they're seeping down, or around a stream or something like that. So I guess the ebony refers to the stem, and which turns a really dark color, and then the fertile fronds are like 24 inches long, and the sterile fronds are 2 to 6 inches long. So this would be good for a rock garden. Maidenhair spleenwort, so 6 to 8 inches tall, native, evergreen, full shade, similar to the other that you saw. This one makes these really pretty rosettes, very pretty. And, I guess it's a pretty large genus. I haven't really seen a lot of these available, even at native plant nurseries. So sourcing them might be a little difficult, but I do know if you go up into the mountain areas that some of the nurseries that are up there do sell some of these different ferns. So that might be an interesting place to look. The good old Boston fern. This one's tropical. I mentioned it. It's in the house, although they do well on your porch in the summertime. And they make a really good patio or house plant. But as I mentioned, you got to miss this thing when you bring it in the house in the winter time, because it will fall. All of the little leaflets will fall off, and it will be very sad looking. And then you'll get bored of it and stick it out on your porch, kind of like the poinsettias that we all have after Christmas. So if you're going to bring it inside, make sure that you're taking care of it to kind of keep it looking healthy. And then you can, of course, cut back the fronds if you put it outside in the spring, and it will leaf back out and look really pretty. Bird's nest fern. This again is a tropical fern, so you can put it out during the summertime, but make sure you bring it in. Does pretty good in indirect light. So most house plants that we have here are understory plants, selected specifically for that reason, that they're understory, so they can tolerate not much light at all, and they're pretty slow growing. So this is a good house plant. And as of note here, it says the fern is sensitive to fluoride, so might just want to buy distilled water in bottles to use on this plant. Staghorn fern. I actually have one of these. I got it from Creative Enterprises. Had I thought ahead, I would have grabbed it and brought it up here, but it can get up to 3 foot tall. It has those little forked fronds, look a little bit like antlers. You can see here somebody put it on a mount. I guess, to make it look that like a, you know, a mount of a deer or something like that. It also is an epiphyte. Again, it, you know, not a parasite, just an epiphyte. It's just living, it's using that, its host as a support structure to get where it wants to be. And these guys, you just mist them like an air plant, and it's perfectly happy living outside. It gets plenty of moisture. And that's basically it. Look, I had a minute to spare. So this is my information, and the unshare. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Let me see here. If anybody, let's see. What is the blade in the fern frond diagram? All right. What? No. All right, I don't know what's going on here. That's really odd.
That is odd.
It's I don't even understand what the heck is going on. I don't usually have this many technical difficulties. All right, let me try again. Can you see it? Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. All right, so let's see what chat does. What is the blade in the fern frond diagram?
Oh, the blade. Yeah.
Oh, that's just going to be the blade of the leaf. So the individual little, so each of those structures is going to have a little leaflet on there. That little leaflet is going to be the blade. Should you put holes in the bottom of the tub? It's a good question. So really, I assume that's in response to the propagation part of it. So really, there's no need to if you're misting it. So ideally, what you would do is whatever sterile soil you have in there, if you put it in your hand and squished it up, it would be able to hold together. But you wouldn't have water squishing out of it like a sponge. And if you opened your hand, it wouldn't crumble apart because that would be too dry. So ideally, it would hold its shape. If you squished it together like this, it would hold that ball shape. So that's what's going to be in there. And then you have the plastic over the top, and then you would mist that top, you know, couple centimeters to keep it nice and moist for that fern. So you're not actually going to pour any water in that where you would need drainage holes. It should never get to that point because it's going to be a self-contained little greenhouse. Let's see. I wonder if you could spread the spores directly into your soil. Must you make starters? Well, I think doing the starters is kind of a guaranteed way that you know you're going to get, as long as you're harvesting the spores at the correct time, that you'll get the best germination rates. So, you know, who wants to waste their time? I mean, sure, you can do a direct sow if you want to try that. But again, you know, they've got to have the perfect conditions, and ferns are going to need a much moister environment than the typical yard is going to be. It's just, I mean, I have an old ravine on the side of my property, and sometimes I'll see ferns that will kind of just pop up there. But again, you're not going to get really good germination unless you're helping them along. I guess it's a good way to just get more of them. But I mean, you can certainly try to direct sow. We have resurrection ferns at vines in the children's maze. I wouldn't have told anybody because now people come steal them. No, I'm just kidding.
No, they won't.
Autumn fern is definitely naturalizing in forests. Depends on where it is. Again, I said category 4. There's definite categories in how it's considered invasive, and it is still considered a category 4. So they are watching it, but there are things out there that are considerably more invasive. I started with 5 plants and still have only 5 plants. I love them. They get larger, but have not spread at all. Exactly like mine. In fact, I had one that died back this last winter. It was in a less protected area and it got zapped. It never came back. So, they are not 100% invincible. Collect rainwater and use it for your bird's nest fern. Mine are going crazy. Yes. Well, I encourage folks to collect rainwater anyway and use it in your landscape. That's an excellent way to knock your water bill down. Cindy, so many ferns. Just as an aside, if y'all weren't aware, Water Resources, Gwinnett Water Resources, their outreach department with John Butler does a rain garden and rain barrel workshop. And for, I think it's $40, he'll basically walk you through how to make a rain barrel. He brings the kits, helps you make them, and then you take them home and set them up. So it's an excellent, and you get a stormwater credit. So it's a great program. Thank you. And interesting info. Yay. Good content. Did not know air plants and horsetails fit. Yes, all sorts of interesting stuff. And Hall County Master Gardener sale next weekend, and there's usually at least one fern vendor there. Okay, yay for fern shopping. Okay, so again, this should, let me make sure that yes, I actually started recording again. So this has been recorded and will pop up on the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. So I think that's basically it. If nobody else has any other questions, can get a free if member of the Georgia Native Plant Society and join Native Plant Rescues. Yes, definitely, Amber. I think I got you hooked on Georgia Native Plant Society. So they do a lot of native plant rescues. So that's a good way. And they also have, and there's also some plant sales. Oh, thank you. The window. All right. Let me stop sharing here. And background none. Okay, there's my window.
Nice.
So here's one of my little air plants. And he's just a little epiphyte hanging out on the pumice stone there. I have this one's hooked, but I don't know if you can see, I've got Yellow Daisy Festival, but it's got little air plants that just kind of hang out
Okay.
on pieces of I don't know, they're just, I guess it's solder that you would use, but they used it to kind of make curly cues and things. So I just have all sorts of little epiphytes hanging out on there. And then I have a lot of succulents and other interesting little plants and things that live behind me on my sunny window in my kitchen. Because otherwise I have trees all around me. So that's basically my only sunny window. So anyway, that's basically it. So hopefully you guys learned something new about ferns, and maybe you didn't realize there were so many different varieties that did well here in Georgia, but there are, and this kind of maybe inspires you to go out and look at some of the native plant nurseries and see if you can source some of these. But I guarantee we all have at least one shady spot around our yard that's perfect for some of you guys. So with that, that's basically it. So thank you for coming, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.
Bye,
Bye.
Lisa.
Good
Bye.
show.
Bye.
Bye.
That was awesome. I
y'all.
loved it.
Good. Bye.